So I'm going to kind of kick us off here, and then a few people will probably be continuing to join us, and I do expect we have a number of people too that are just going to be watching the recording, which is great. This webinar is recorded for convenience of people who can't make it on at this particular date and time, but want to be able to catch this program, and we appreciate people who are watching after the fact as well. So to get us started, my name is Elizabeth Nielsen, and I am the co-founder of Fluence, and I'm very excited to be here on this webinar today with Kayli Howard. I'll tell you a little bit more about how we brought this together momentarily, but just in welcoming all of you, I want to say, Fluence is a program that is dedicated to education and training in the field of psychedelic therapy. Our primary mission, our primary goal is to work with clinicians, psychotherapists, and people that are really direct care providers and support them in getting the skills and knowledge and competencies that are needed to be able to provide care that includes psychedelics or care that just includes talking about psychedelics in licensed mental health care settings, including state licensure programs in the United States. There are now several of those in various stages. And we also do a lot of work with drug developers and with clinical research trials. So we have a number of programs where we partner with drug developers that are running clinical trials of psychedelic therapies, psychedelic medicines for various indications, trying to really improve the delivery and the availability of psychedelics through the healthcare system. And those clinical partner trials are working on phase 2 and 3 trials, primarily with psychedelics like psilocybin and DMT and 5-MeO-DMT and others that you've probably heard of. And we're really excited to be part of advancing healthcare in that way and really advancing the knowledge and advancing the research. So we're witnessing what's going on in the research. We're doing a lot of translating of that and helping it to bring it to the community of mental health care providers. Our webinars are usually held once a month. They are available to the community, to clinicians, and we're so excited that you're here. Again, there's returning students, there's people that are totally new to us, and these are just nice ways for us to have conversations and for you to hear about people that are really working in the field or really have interesting perspectives in the field. My role today is really going to be one of moderator and host. Some of you are familiar with me from seeing me speak in person or maybe having met me at trainings. Many of you will have seen me in videos. If you've been to some of our Fluence programs, you've seen demonstration videos or introductory videos that I've hosted. But here I am live hosting this program. And I just want to say a little bit about how we met Kayli and how she became part of our program. She was one of the first students in our very nascent program on psilocybin facilitation in Oregon. Going back a couple of years now, when Oregon began licensing training programs to provide licensure qualifying education in psilocybin facilitation, Fluence was one of the very first programs to obtain a license to provide that education in Oregon. And we had a state license. You have to have a license from the state to be able to provide that education. And so we have this program that is focused on providing this type of education for people who already had a clinician's background, a mental health care background. And Kayli was part of one of our very early courses there. And she went through the program and brought just a wealth of experience and knowledge and passion for this field to it, and then graduated and started actually working as one of the very first licensed facilitators in Oregon in service center settings and working with clients. And really has had quite a prolific practice that she's going to tell us about today on this program. And I think this is really it's a unique experience, a unique type of person to be, or a unique field to be in, because it's working with something where we have some research about it, we have some evidence about it, yet it's not really available through the mental health care system, the traditional mental health care system, but it is available through this state licensure model. And in Oregon, it's an adult use model, supervised adult use model. So it's not even really considered the same as healthcare. It's sort of a separate system, akin to it, but not the same. So this opens up a lot of opportunity, but it also opens up a new field where there's just a lot of unknowns and things are not established yet. And ways of doing things are not necessarily so well established yet. And so we've been really excited to witness some of our graduates going out there, getting started. And now what we're seeing is after 2 years in Oregon, we're preparing to be offering a similar program in Colorado, where there's a new approval for such things called the Natural Medicine Health Act. And there will be, programs that can provide licensure qualifying education there. So I know some of you here are probably interested in that. We'll post a link for you if you want to just get on our mailing list to learn more about that. If you're here, you're on our mailing list, so you'll get some information anyway, but if you'd like to express interest, we'll give you an opportunity to do so. Don't have a whole lot of details about that yet because it's not fully established and up and running. But I think that what we're going to talk about here is going to be really highly relevant in terms of it being similar to the type and way of practice that one might establish in Colorado through this Natural Medicine Health Act. So very exciting developments going on. I want to stop talking now myself after I've given you the download and introduce Kayli and ask her to introduce herself and tell us about your background and how you came into this field and wound up becoming one of the first facilitators in a state legal licensed program.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for having me here and for the whole Fluence program. Yeah, my path to this work began with my own relationship with mushrooms. I have been using them for my own healing for 15 or so years, um, always with intention and purpose behind it. However, my relationship as a facilitator kind of evolved over that time as well too. My first career was as a writer, writing screenplays, book, every kind of writing you could do. And it kind of during the pandemic, the beginning of the pandemic, just the idea of writing about fake people and fake problems wasn't really appealing to me anymore. And I wanted to work with real people and help them find real resolutions. So I went back to school and got my master's in psychology. And I trained as a marriage and family therapist, which was all really useful in my work as a psychedelic facilitator. But during the pandemic, my husband and I were living in LA, and it just was not feeling so great anymore. So we decided to move up to Portland. And as we were moving up, Measure 109 passed. Literally, actually, as we were driving up, I read the news and was like, this is kind of meant to be. And so I knew I had to be a part of this movement that was happening. And so as soon as I could enter a training program to get licensed, I did. And I chose Fluence because of the mental health workers that they were kind of focusing their education around, the trauma-informed care, uh, so important. And yeah, as soon as I could get licensed, I did. While I was at Fluence, I also spent the year apprenticing with ketamine. Not because I had any intention of working with ketamine, but because I wanted experience above ground sitting with individuals. And that was all useful. And I got my license basically a year ago. And since then, I've worked with dozens and dozens of individuals, almost 100. And it's been incredibly moving, incredibly worthwhile, the most meaningful work I could ever imagine doing.
Well, it's really exciting. So it's been a year, and I know, it's been so there's been changes in the world, changes in the, just the very program in Oregon in terms of service centers coming online and testing facilities coming online. You've been witness to a great transition there.
Mhm.
I wonder if you could give us a little bit of sense of what it's like to be part of this field. You're sort of in the bubble of really on the ground knowing what's going on and living it on a daily life, and yet there's all sorts of outside chatter about it and media and hype and questions and this and that, maybe coming from folks that don't know so much about it. What's your sort of overall holistic sense of how it's going?
Great. I mean, I would say if we're going off of like what I have witnessed and what I've heard my colleagues witness, it's it's been incredible. And I think because I'm in it and it's been so immersed in it the past year, for me, it feels really normalized, this work and what we do. It doesn't feel so stigmatized as it might in a different state or different country. It feels like very obvious. I do, what's so interesting is that we have, as facilitators here, we're seeing more than any clinical study has ever seen in terms of all of us facilitators in Oregon, the number of people who have come through. But we are the ones who know the outcomes because there's no like recording of these outcomes. Well, the clients aren't asked to report anything. And so I feel like we're holding all of this information of these huge transformations that are happening that would be so worthwhile for, everyone to understand so that this could be more federally, accepted and mentally accepted by, the country, the greater
Mhm,
population.
mhm. Yeah, I do think there's something to be said for that sort of practice-based knowledge. And but even just like more and more people in the community knowing that and people having those experiences can help destigmatize and help
Hmm.
make it a more accepted practice all around.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I see, like I see judges from the South come, like different people who you wouldn't expect. Most people who are coming to this work in Oregon are people who are traveling to Oregon. I would say maybe 5 to 10% of my practice is Oregonians, and the rest of them are people who are flying in who have read an article or watched How to Change Your Mind or read the book or something like that, and they've tried everything, and they now are coming to this, and so they are then going back to their, corners of the country and sharing with their friends and family, what shifted for them.
Yeah. Which brings to mind two things, right? One is important that the care they receive is a high standard and is quality, and they're sort of have a good experience in terms of just the quality of the container. And that is what this program is designed to create, right? With
Mhm.
regulation and training and education. But also that it just takes time for people to become more familiar with this in
Mhm.
wider circles. If I could ask you what are some of the sort of maybe common misconceptions that folks have when they're reaching out to you about it? Do you have a
Uh,
sense of those?
yeah, I think some people, I very much have to preface with everyone across the board, this is not a magic bullet. This is not like a pulling a rabbit out of a hat trick kind of thing. Like this is going to require your own agency as well too. And I think some people are looking for a quick fix. And so I think that that's really important to like remember that if you don't do the work preparing yourself and integrating afterwards, it's not going to be as worthwhile as it would if you did come into it with intention and carried it forward on the other side. And I think that that's maybe the biggest one. I think that then there's also the fear, like, will I lose my mind? Will I come back? From just the stigma around psychedelics for decades that, people have seen things where, this is your brain on drug. I think that some of that, needs some massaging and new PR campaign behind it. But I think that, yeah, fear of losing your mind and hope to just take the drug and be a different person, or the fear that they will be a totally different person on the other side, and not
Right.
that they still have free will to, shift.
Right, right. So there's a little bit of maybe anxiety about letting go of the problem, but also a desire just to get help with the problem. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And are you seeing people that are predominantly they have experienced psychedelics, they haven't experienced psychedelics, are they really, just psychedelic enthusiasts that are trying this, or are they people that are totally new to it?
Mainly psychedelic naive. Most people are coming in without having ever done a psychedelic. I've had, a handful of people who have gone to a retreat and it wasn't a great experience. And so, maybe in Jamaica or something like that, where group work wasn't really the right setting for them. And then some people who, maybe in college, they tried some with some friends. They weren't sure if it worked or not. They're in their 70s now or 60s now. So most people have not tried any psychedelic, but I would say across the board, nobody has done them with the eye shade on, which is really different because I'm assuming most people in here, you've probably, if you're thinking about doing this, have taken psilocybin at some point, but not everybody in here has done it with an eye shade on in this kind of set and setting with the music. And that really changes the experience. It's so, so different. And so I would say, unless they did the eye shade at a retreat, which oftentimes they have not, I would say like almost everyone has never done that before.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So your role in explaining that is really, it's really critical for people to even to just understand that difference, that this is different from other settings.
Yeah. And in the preparation for that, there's a huge part of prepping them in the process of letting go, letting go of control, trusting all of that. Because if you have an eye shade on and you're with a stranger, I mean, hopefully we've developed a bond and you don't feel I'm a stranger coming into it. But you have to trust a lot in yourself, in me, in the mushrooms, in the process to really allow yourself to let go. Because if you don't, it'll be a more anxiety ridden experience.
Yeah. Could you walk us through a little bit of how you kind of construct your process with your clients, like what
Yeah.
your practice looks like in terms of,
Yeah.
obviously you meet the what's required by Oregon, by the state law, but how do you really construct that flow for folks to get through this process?
Yeah. So every facilitator has their own method of doing this that, like you said, how follows the regulations. And every client I work with, it's not like a cookie cutter approach. Everybody gets a kind of what works for them. But basically, the scaffolding around how I work is that I do an intro call that's free to make sure that we feel like a good fit. And I ask a couple of screening questions to make sure that, with between meds and history, that this would make sense. And if we choose to work together, I like to have our first preparation session, typically through Zoom, about 2 weeks before you come out to Oregon, so that there's enough time for you to prepare. And during that, after the intro call, I send you all of the Oregon forms, and there's a lot of those, as well as my own intake, which is about 16 pages. So it's really in depth about your substance history, family history, what meds you're currently on, what you want out of this, what you're afraid of going into this. It's really to help the client begin to focus in and help me understand how to support them. So our first Zoom session is usually about 2 hours long, and we go deeper into this intake. And I ask questions, and they ask questions, and then I typically begin to, depending on the individual and what they need, maybe we practice some breathing or mindfulness or somatic techniques that would be helpful for them to work on in the weeks coming into the experience. I then send them an email after that first meeting, where the resources are specifically for them. Maybe it's a podcast on letting go, maybe it's a visualization, maybe it's journal prompts to help focus them on an intention, different ideas for mantras to connect their breath to help them regulate themselves during the session. And I stress it's not required, it's just encouraged to prepare yourself for it. You can put in as much as you want, but what we see is the more you put into that preparation intentionally, the more people tend to get out of it and are able to let go through the process. I like to then meet people the day before they take the mushrooms in person. So we're not just meeting the day of the mushrooms. And typically that's at my office here in Portland.
Mhm.
And during that session, we're checking in on what the past few weeks have been. We're getting clear on intention and mantra. We do some exercises to kind of begin to tap into the unconscious. We talk about everything that is going to lead into the next day in terms of music and sense and what they should eat and any questions, so that any anxieties they're having around, what's going to happen, we
Mhm.
can answer, besides the mystery of we don't know what's going to happen when you take the mushrooms, but we're going to trust that it's all going to be useful. The mushroom session itself is at a service center. I work at a couple of different ones here in Portland, and they all have different kind of intros as people arrive. But then when they arrive, they come in. We check in again. The service center rep sells them their mushrooms. I am with them the entire time during their journey, holding space, often writing down things they say if they give me consent to do so, to share with them on the other side, helping them ground if they get ungrounded. And towards the end of the session, just really listening if they feel ready to share. I then like to meet them the day after the mushroom session for our first integration session, because at that point they really are able to kind of share their narrative of what they remember, of what was really charged for them during the session. And I'm able to share with them things I wrote down if they would like that. And we begin to think about what would be helpful for them over the next few weeks, what commitments they want to make to themselves to begin to unfold further in the process and take this window of neuroplasticity and really use it. And so after that session, I send another email with maybe book recs, maybe a link to a psychedelic society in their town for integration circles, maybe therapist recommendations, just resources to help support them. Then 2 to 3 weeks later, I like to meet again through Zoom or in person if they're here in Portland, to check in and hear, what's been shifting, what's been changing, what are you noticing in yourself, in your relationships, in your body, in your mind. And some people choose to have more integration sessions that follow that, or maybe even 6 months later, they want to check in or come back and take the mushrooms again 6 months later. And so kind of everybody's different. There's no one size fits all approach, but that's kind of the gist of the scaffolding around my practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. And so sometimes people are able to follow up with resources in their own community if they're coming in from further away, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then, obviously they may not have that. Do you do repeat sessions with people? Do you have people come back, or what's your sort of framework around
I
that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I really encourage them, like, take your time to integrate the experience. I don't want to see you again until at least 4 months. I want you to, I really believe in that Alan Watts quote, when you get the message, hang up the phone. And I
Mhm.
think that we shouldn't be living in these psychedelics, that like we need to take the information they gave us and really work with it. And so people respect that, and usually I'm giving big doses, so people need time to kind of really get on board with everything that came to them during the experience, and sometimes it takes weeks or months before things really click. I often get emails from people months later that they're like, oh my god, this is happening with my daughter now that I never expected, or this is happening,
Mhm.
that it takes time. And so coming in with a new intention after having done the work, I think is really important. But yes, I have lots of people who come back, and people who sometimes come back who came as individuals who come back with their partner to do couples work. That's pretty common as well too. Um, yeah,
Okay. So or when you do that, do you do actual a couple sessions with two people at once?
I
That's something
do.
you can do.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a
yeah,
whole
yeah.
nother
That's a
track
whole
of
other
work.
thing. Mm-hmm,
Yeah,
mm-hmm,
interesting. And you have the
mm-hmm,
background for that with your training
mm-hmm,
and education.
mm-hmm,
Interesting.
mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah.
There's definitely different considerations in that, but same with group work. I
Mm.
think that there's just different things to keep in mind when doing it, but it can be really beautiful experience.
Yeah. Yeah, very much so. As a practitioner and as a professional now in this emerging field, um, what resources do you find helpful now? Like how do you kind of continue to stay on top of the research
Hmm.
and just even the changing regulations or updates to that?
Hmm.
What are your favorite resources?
Well, psychedelics aside, I think thematic experiencing is really important. I think that, we were having a consultation group a couple weeks ago talking about, what have you really taken from this? And I think something that was loud already, but is louder after this year, is just how connected the mind and body are, and helping people kind of relax their body so that their mind can also fold into this experience, I think is really helpful. So learning new somatic experiencing techniques, taking different courses and workshops, and that I think is really helpful. And in terms of psychedelics, I think, attending the conferences, reading the books, just staying curious, and, going to the conferences, reading the books, listening to Indigenous voices, kind of just really staying connected, and downloading as much as you can consistently, I think is important as as a mental health provider, but also in the psychedelic space. I think just to stay current and fresh, and remember that there is, always more for us to learn here.
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of ongoing education, contact with colleagues,
Hmm.
but general
Consultation.
consultation, very
Hmm.
important. very important.
Mhm.
Um, and I know that some of the differences that we obviously between Oregon and Colorado is that at least at the time of the program in Oregon, when we got licensed, they didn't actually require ongoing continuing education or consultation post licensure.
Mm.
I think that the Colorado law looks a little bit different there. So there is a post licensure consultation phase for
Yeah.
folks, which I firmly believe in. I think that'll be really
Yeah.
helpful.
Yeah.
And you may actually be offering that as part of our program because we're going to be including you
Mhm.
there on that faculty. But you know, most of the people that I've heard from are doing that informally anyway. They have, you know, consultation groups, peer groups, and
Mhm.
talking with each other because you need that. And as you know, from my background coming from doing this in research, we had it built into our research settings and we had it built into our co-therapist relationships, and we were, you know, we had ongoing contact with trainers and supervisors,
Mhm. Mhm.
consultants and things. So it was very much a part of doing it in that environment. And I'm glad to see that that trend has continued. People really
Yeah.
taking it in, taking it to heart, and continuing
Mhm.
to learn.
Mhm.
Um, I wanted to ask, you know, if there are things that you have encountered in your practice that have been challenging, difficult scenarios. You know, people often the questions we get are sort of, well, what do I do if there's a worst case scenario? And we know that these things can be rare, but they're also important. So, what are some of your sort of approaches to working with challenges, working with people that may be having a challenging time during
Yeah.
that session?
Yeah. I think staying as grounded and non-judgmental as possible is the key, not getting freaked out. I
Mhm.
just had a baby a couple of weeks ago, and when I was in my like intense labor pains, I remember the midwives were like so calm, and I was like, this can't be normal. But I'm looking at them and they were like, no, it's normal. It's okay. And I felt so grounded looking at them and knowing that they were like, this is okay. And I reminds me a lot of the role as a facilitator of, when someone's really losing it, that no, it's okay. Like you're okay. And so whether I've had clients who get really sexualized under the mushrooms and, have made really big advances. And taking space, setting boundaries, being firm, but also non-judgmental, especially as they begin to come back on board and the shame and embarrassment comes, just really holding space for that.
Mhm.
I think when people, as I mentioned, get really freaked out, like sometimes when the ego dissolution happens, as empowering as it is when if they forget who they are, they begin to freak out sometimes. And then as they remember who they are, it can be really empowering. But in that moment of the freak out, just staying really calm and really grounded, helping breathe by breathing beside them, and helping them kind of like regulate, like without them even realizing that that's happening, can be helpful. So a lot of things in preparation, I ask people to bring something to hold, or I give them different rocks to hold, and that can be really grounding for them. The mantra is so that they have something to kind of connect their breath to if they do go off course. So whether they choose let go or allow or I'm here or I'm okay, repeating their mantra back to them and helping them remember, right, I'm okay. I'm okay. I'm here. Whatever their mantra might be. So I think a lot
Mhm.
of the preparation is helping for those distressing situations that could come up. However, sometimes wild things happen, and there's service center reps that are always at the service center. And in some instances, I have texted them, can you be outside the room? And I've never had to have anyone come into the room. I've been at the center when that has happened, when people have had to come in and deal with the situation and the client. But again, I think just staying really non-judgmental and calm throughout it has always
Mhm.
brought things back around. I've never seen a situation spiral out of control completely. It always comes back on board. And so just trusting that you can bring it back.
Yeah. And I think that analogy that you made of, you know, the giving birth and the labor and the people around you being calm because they've been through this process, they've seen this, so they can kind of instill that trust in you, even if it's you're in it and you're
Mm-hmm.
like, this can't be
Mm-hmm.
right. That makes a lot of sense. Um,
Hmm.
and I do think that our sort of capacity to trust that process is really one of the most reassuring and grounding things that we can give people.
Yeah.
And yet I've also had people say, well, how can you know that it's going to be all right? I mean, this is, you're talking about psychedelics, you're talking about psilocybin, isn't it risky? Isn't it this and that? And all of that screening that we do and all of those conversations that we have, we're kind of using our judgment every single moment leading up to that to identify any red flags or times that we might say, hey, this probably isn't a good idea. So I'm wondering if you could speak to any things that you've identified or that you've seen
Yeah.
that have caused you to say, hey, we should put the pause on this. This isn't a good idea. Maybe not right now, or maybe
Yeah.
this way. What have you seen that has caused you to exercise that judgment?
Yes, I'm going to answer that, but I'm also just going to say, I think another thing to mention around these difficult experiences is how useful they are. And in the
Mm,
integration phase, if you've had a difficult experience, I've never seen it not be worthwhile for somebody on the other side. And that's why integrating and talking about it and finding the meaning in it is so important. So I think that I sometimes describe these difficult experiences as a prescribed fire burn because sometimes it needs to all burn down so things can grow back. And so sometimes these difficult experiences need to happen and they're so worthwhile. Back to the other question though,
right.
red flags.
Yep.
Yes. People who are in a rush who are like, okay, I want to do this next week. Red flag because they're really hoping for a quick fix, and that's not the process that I like working in.
Hmm.
I think, certain meds that they're on, we have to make sure that, if they're on an SSRI, that doesn't disqualify them, but they have to understand, that they may have a blunted experience and there may be disappointment there. If they are on an antipsychotic, that would be a red flag. If they have a history of bipolar disorder, that would be a red flag. That doesn't disqualify them, but it is something to like really create a lot of awareness for them around, the outcomes around that. Um, if they exhibit extreme narcissism in a call, that's going to be pretty loud because, as mental health providers, even without psychedelics, narcissism is pretty hard to treat. And especially with psychedelics, I find people who have narcissistic personality disorder, it really, and obviously we're not diagnosing people, but if they fill out a 16-page intake and we have an intro call or our first prep session, you can usually see enough stuff around that. And so it doesn't mean that they're disqualified. It just means that it's going to be harder for them to reflect and have a transformation that is worthwhile. Um, what other things are red flags? I would say those are the main ones. I think that everything else is a conversation, but
Hmm.
definitely meds, prior mental health diagnoses, and just unwilling to like really give themselves to the process.
Yeah. So maybe lack of engagement or lack of participation.
Yeah, just hoping like, oh, I don't really have time to like, prepare, but like, can we just, can I come next week and do it? And that energy is just not. I never let anyone come before 2 weeks because I think that it's really important to take that time to get in the right mindset.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's consistent with, the timeframes in research studies, even if we're not, considering that as a a gatekeeping thing. There is that time frame where we are engaged with people, we are watching people, we are, evaluating them and meeting with them several times. Most research studies have some sort of structure around that. So people aren't just like checking into the clinic in the morning and doing a bunch of surveys and
Right.
getting dosed at 11 a.m. There's quite a lot of process that leads up to that. And I do think that that approach of really evaluating people and asking people to evaluate their own readiness, making sure
Hmm.
that they're
Because
ready.
I think Oregon, you only need to prepare, I think you have to prepare 24 hours before. I think that that's the regulations. So you can find a facilitator who would be willing to work with you in a shorter
Right.
time frame. I'm just not that facilitator.
Well, and that makes sense. And that's, I think that speaks to each practitioner creating the processes and the practice that really works for them. So there's the regulations and there's the requirements, and then there's your practice and your structure, which may not be the right thing for everybody, but it is the way that you want to work, and you have a lot of choices baked into that. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, Really interesting. I wonder, if there are other things that, that you want to tell us, that you want to share about your experience over the course of this year, things that you're kind of hopeful for from the field, like things that be helpful for, for the field as organizing or regulatory stuff. Are there barriers at
Yeah.
that level right now?
I think, I'm seeing, in the past, I don't know when it began, the fund for people who can't afford these services. But I think that there's, a lot of things happening with group work that's beginning to start, and fundraising for individuals and groups who come from marginalized communities to be able to take in this, because the overhead is expensive. It's expensive as a facilitator to have this license and work, and it's expensive for somebody to come out and do this in this framework, because of course you could get a bag of mushrooms, wherever you are. And, mushrooms in Oregon, they're really expensive. That alone, the cost of mushrooms. And so there's definitely more opportunities that are coming for individuals and groups. And I think that that's great. Um, I know that they're making some amendments to the regulations, and I think that, there's a lot more organizing around facilitators now to kind of push on things that right. And there's, different consultation groups, and I think just more of a framework around things that are being built. And like you mentioned, I don't know if Oregon's going to require continued education, but there was a meeting a couple of weeks ago with some psychedelic fund, or they're providing insurance and a whole paperwork sort of program. And they were talking about, if you join this, continued education will be a part of it. And so that conversation is happening, which I think is great. I think there's a lot of paperwork for clients. And I think that that's useful in one way. But again, I don't think it should be required that clients need to state their outcomes. But I do think it would be nice if they had the opportunity to follow up with how they're doing, so that we could have some sort of data on that. Um,
Mhm.
would be nice.
Yeah, I recall there being quite a lot of conversation about that. And there are obviously concerns about respecting people's rights and privacy and all of that.
Hmm.
And at the same time, it is a grand experiment, and it's really important to know how it's going on a larger scale and in a way that it can be evaluated. So hopefully,
Hmm.
I'm not aware of exactly what the status of that is, but hopefully there's something in the works there that can, be provide a balanced view.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Really interesting. I think it's a fascinating program, and it's interesting that now it's growing, and I know it's going to be a little bit different in Colorado. But if you were thinking about anybody thinking about considering becoming a facilitator, what are some of the things that you might, tip people off to think about or to consider before
Yeah.
making a decision to go into a program like this and
Yeah.
essentially set up a practice around it? Because it's become, over the course of 2 years, I mean, you did the training program, which was 150 hours of 160 hours of training, plus obviously there's time outside of that, there's readings, there's meetings, and then there's travel and all of that. And then you were also doing this ketamine practicum, which is an amazing other way to get experience, right? And because at that point, for folks that aren't aware, there were very, very few licensed service centers in the first year or two, even of this program. Really, now there's I think a 2 dozen or so, but in the beginning, we didn't have opportunities for people to go and sit in on sessions.
Yeah.
There wasn't that wasn't available. So you created that in another way, which I think is really just very motivated move to make.
Hmm.
But it's taken a lot of dedication, right? It's taken a lot of
Hmm.
time, a lot of
Hmm.
dedication, a lot of energy, a lot of investment of your attention and resources, and then creating this practice, which is, you know, really, I think a full-time thing now. It's like it's your main thing.
Hmm. Hmm.
But what would you kind of ask people to think critically
Yeah.
about, if they were
Yeah.
thinking about doing something like this?
Yeah, I think it's really important to have your own mindfulness-based practice coming into it. And if you don't, begin to develop one because you're going to be dealing with a lot of stuff, a lot of people's stuff. And so you need to have a way to anchor and feel grounded and it be authentic, especially if you're going to be trying to impart these tools on others. I think mindfulness is like really important to cultivate within yourself, whether that's, sitting down to meditate for 10 minutes every day or journaling or, nature walks without headphones or whatever it is for you that can help you ground because you do take on a lot of people's stuff. And I think that some occasionally I have a session that is really draining, but for me, I feel really energized by doing this work. And everybody's different. But if you are like a real empath and that can serve you, but it also you need to have the psychic boundaries to be able to protect yourself because you are dealing with people who are really unloading their trauma and sometimes reliving their trauma before you and holding space for that and not being rocked by it and being able to do that a couple of times a week at least is big. And so having the tools to ground yourself and having a real interest in people and a trust in that we are capable of change and really feeling optimistic around that, I think is important coming into this work.
Yeah. No, it's a very, very important point to have the tools and resources to be able to stay balanced yourself while doing
Mm-hmm.
these very intensive processes for sure. Yeah.
I
Preparation.
would say it's the the best job that there is, though. I love what I do. It's really, really meaningful.
Super cool. Um, we have a couple questions in the chat that I'd like to
Hmm.
get to because
Sure.
people um have asked some really interesting questions here. So I'm not necessarily going exactly in the order they came in, but I'm going to try to get to as many of them as I can. One of them was about transportation. And I know
Hmm.
that there's a transportation agreement that's part of the Oregon paperwork, but if people are traveling and coming from out of town and then maybe going back to a hotel or an Airbnb or something, how do you handle that? Do they have to have somebody come pick them up? Do they have, are they able to take an Uber or something? What's your standard around that?
Yeah, they can take an Uber, but I walk them out to the Uber. Oftentimes we talk about before they take the mushrooms, I may take it like might want to give me your phone at the end and I can call your Uber on your phone for you. Because sometimes looking at the phone might be weird or might not be ready for the text messages that come on when you get your phone back. Oftentimes people are staying at Airbnbs or hotels like a couple of blocks from the center. So sometimes I walk them back to the door of their hotel or their Airbnb. And all of this is determined beforehand and written in the transportation agreement. So it's not like a surprise, like, oh, I'll just walk you back. Like we know that I'm going to walk you back coming into it.
Right. So having a plan in place and knowing what that plan is very clear, super,
Hmm.
super important.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. I have
Hmm.
found a similar standard in research studies as well. Like make a clear plan so
Hmm.
everybody knows what it is and there's no surprises.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, Someone else asked, what is your opinion on long distance Zoom sessions when the therapist is not in the room? I believe this is with regard to dosing sessions. So there
Oh, I
wouldn't
don't
be
do
an
that.
allowance for that under the Oregon legislation. And I don't believe that Colorado would allow that either as a facilitator to be facilitating something by distance. You can do your
And I wouldn't recommend it.
yeah, you can do your prep session by distance.
Hmm.
Um, I have I mean, in research studies, we have not had long distance facilitators on Zoom, although sometimes we have done, prep and integration sessions, the follow-up sessions that way. Telemedicine, interestingly, prior to the pandemic, that pretty much never really happened because there was wasn't much of a provision for it. But afterward, everybody wrote it into the protocols. We really needed it. But what do you think about that idea, Kaylee? It's like if
Yeah,
Oregon's,
I would.
yeah, you can do Zoom psilocybin sessions. They just go to the service center and you're at home and at your home office and you're just zooming in. What do you think?
I wouldn't feel safe doing that. I wouldn't feel safe on their behalf doing that. I think so much of the grounding comes from having a person in the room who, if you have to go to the bathroom, they're going to take you to the bathroom, that I can change the playlist, that I can put a grounding hand on their arm, that it was also pre-discussed, determined, to help them. I think having a person in the room is essential, necessary, required.
Yeah. Yeah. There's something about, I think I'm just sort of expanding on that, but like the way that people sort of may slip below into a sort of a pre-verbal state or a non-verbal state, that they can still kind of read the sensation of having somebody there with them, but they may not be able to verbalize or like ask for help. And I just don't know that you could translate that
Hmm.
relational support over Zoom when you're in that, giving that to someone when you're in that state, because it does really require you to be online with language, communicate that way if you're communicating um over, over the Zoom. So yeah, but it is an interesting model. And I know there's a need to reach people in remote areas, and I know there's a need to be flexible around people who have, maybe are unable to, they're homebound, they're unable to travel, things like that. So I am always interested in how we can make services more accessible. Um,
Hmm.
but I do think that just even having prep and integration sessions by Zoom is a huge help for a lot
Hmm.
of folks. So
Yeah.
so that's an interesting topic. Um, you mentioned a borderline personality disorder, or you alluded to it, I think, in some of you're talking about it. And I'm just wondering if you would consider that, or personalities in general, a red flag, or how you might work with somebody that had maybe borderline tendencies, meaning diagnostically where it's like,
Yeah.
um, on the edge of maybe not being so in contact with reality all the time.
Yes. I mean, borderline is not a disqualifier, and I've definitely had clients who have borderline do the work, and it is more difficult often. And that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile. But as a facilitator, it can be more difficult because they can be erratic, and also getting them on the page of preparation and trusting me and trusting the experience, trusting the mushrooms as they begin to take hold and they kind of lose touch. It can be challenging,
Mm-hmm.
but again, worthwhile. And so I think a lot of prep around that, a lot of grounding around that, a lot of safety, building safety, because, most borderline, is coming from some complex trauma of some sort. So just kind of holding space for that and letting them feel safe in the relationship, I think is really important. But also, the meds would be important consideration in that. Are they in psychotherapy already? I think that that's a big thing that I ask of people who have, clear mental health diagnoses that could use more support outside of the facilitation, because I'm not their therapist. I want them to be in therapy. And so that would be a requirement. Are you in therapy? Does your therapist agree with you doing this work? Oftentimes, I will speak to people's therapists if they give consent and would like me to do so, so that we can collaborate and be on the same page. And sometimes that's before, and sometimes that's after. And if there's borderline, that would likely be something that I would like to see, that they're in therapy, and perhaps whether speaking to their therapist is useful or not, or at least having their approval from their therapist to do this work.
Yeah, right. So and then that may involve also educating the therapist about what it is
Hmm.
that they're doing, and
Hmm.
because there's, it can be problematic if the therapist is having one conversation with them about it and anxious about it, and then you're having a different conversation with them about it. It can really
Hmm.
you can really
Hmm.
have run into some trouble there. So
Hmm.
yeah, I think that's something a facilitator should think about. Like, how do I interface with other professionals? How do I, explain this to other professionals and talk about the limits of it and talk about how it works? Yeah,
Right.
very important. Very important. Um,
Hmm.
let's see. We have a bunch of questions about very popular topic. Um, let's see, is there any, and this is just a really logistical question about the way the program in Oregon works, but are people working with psilocybin, mushroom natural products? Is there synthetic psilocybin, available? And how do you choose your dose? Like, is there a formula for that? Is it mandated by the state? You decide? How do you do that?
Yeah. Good question. So all of our mushrooms are grown here in Oregon. They're grown in labs and they're tested in labs. They're not like just picked in the forest, although that'd be cute. But the nice thing about them grown in these labs is that they're really measured. And so we know the weight of the mushroom, we know the psilocybin content, we know the psilocin content. And the strains kind of, a lot of them are new to me because there's just so many different strains now, and each center has a bunch of different strains. And so it is more word of mouth between facilitators. This one starts really fast, or this one is more insightful. Of course, there's strains like Golden Teacher or B plus or B positive that we know more about, like Killa Gorilla. But like there's a new one called Bluey Vuitton that like it was just kind of word of mouth that the experiences that people were having, and you choose, sometimes Makilla Gorilla might show up in your body more. And for someone that might be useful who needs to get it reassociated with their body, but for someone who has trauma in their body and wants a gentler experience, I wouldn't give them Makilla Gorilla. So kind of word of mouth, that we're understanding these strains and what we can learn about them before. If there's a higher psilocin content, it might start faster, which might be helpful for some individual over another. Um, if you're not on any SSRIs, I usually start people around 24 milligrams of psilocybin with the option to boost up. If you are on SSRIs, I usually start around 30 or 34. And I'm saying 24 instead of 25 because the amount you take depends how long you have to stay in the center. And so if you boost up, that adds another hour to it. And so 25, 35, 50, these are the lengths of time, 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, seven if we boost up. And so we like to just stay just below the maximum, not because we're trying to get people out the door, but because people often, if they boost, are ready to leave sooner than they legally can leave. And so kind of considering that, but nobody's required to leave at any point. And so I think doing adequate preparation prepares people to take bigger doses. And I do think that bigger doses are more transformative, but we don't want somebody to be taking a dose that really pushes them further out of their element than they can handle, because then they could just be overwhelming rather than useful.
Right. So there's a balancing act. That's one of the things that you're kind of assessing, like
Hmm.
how much can this person integrate? You don't want them to bite off more than they can chew, but at the same time,
Hmm.
you don't want to leave them in a space where they haven't really gone as far as would be helpful for them.
Hmm.
Yeah, and
Hmm.
I totally hear you about like preparation is key for that, because somebody who's able to relax into it and trust you through the process is more likely to be able to have a successful experience on
Macrodoses.
a really full dose.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Have you
And
run
it's a
into,
conversation. Sorry, just
yeah.
a conversation as well in the preparation too with them. And like if they're like, no, I want to take the maximum, kind of talking to them about, what's behind that. Are
Mhm.
you trying to get the most bang for your buck? You flew out here, you want this experience, kind of trying to understand, and
Right,
dissect that as part of it.
right. Is it a sort of, more is more attitude
Hmm.
where
Hmm.
yeah, yeah, that's true. And I'm wondering if you've run into issues with like a ceiling on what's allowed in the state, because there's also, variability in terms of how much people respond to the same dose.
Right. I think that, if you are on an SSRI and trazodone and gabapentin and you have a history of opioid addiction, the maximum dose of 50 milligrams might not be enough for you. And, but we create a lot of awareness around that going into it, that this could be blunting if you're not tapering down. And I'm not encouraging anyone to taper down unless that's something that them and their psychiatrist or therapist have decided that that's best for them. Um, just creating a lot of acceptance and awareness around that. But yeah, I've had very few people that don't launch at all. I've actually only had one person who hasn't launched at all, but she still got somewhere with her experience. And I think, yeah, I think just it would have to do with meds more than anything, that you have a ceiling, because typically the maximum dose is just enough, or more than enough, more than most people need to take.
Right. Right. That makes a lot of sense. Um, we are really getting to the end of our time, and I do want to acknowledge that there are a number of questions that we're probably not going to get to. It's exciting to see how interested and engaged folks are, and I thank you for asking, even if we're not quite going to get to what you're asking about. I did want to
I'll
just,
put my email in the chat too if
yep,
anyone wants to reach out.
I
I'm happy to.
posted, yep, we posted your website and an email, and I think, you know, people can also reach out to us at info@fluencetraining.com is a great way to reach us. You're on our faculty for the Colorado program. I saw a couple questions about education and about Colorado that I wanted to address really quickly. People looking for a mental health counseling or a master's degree program. There are a number of really great programs, academic programs these days, where you can get licensed, and you really need to think about what license you want to get, what state you want to get it in, look at reciprocity, look at requirements, and those sorts of things. There are many that are now more open to talking about psychedelics. I don't have specific recommendations that I make because it's such a particular choice to the individual, your needs, your means, your, you know, whether or not you wouldn't want to be online or brick and mortar. I mean, there are so many choices out there. We are in the process, we as an organization, Fluence, we're in the process of applying to and working with the state of Colorado to get approved to provide licensure qualifying education there. We are applying for a license to be to provide a clinical psilocybin facilitators license, which is a license for people who already have a clinician's license. So you would need a clinician's license of another kind, like as a therapist in Colorado. But if you're already licensed in another jurisdiction or license eligible, you can still come through our program. You just know that you need to actually get that license in Colorado before you can get the psilocybin facilitators license. As far as reciprocity between Oregon and Colorado, we don't yet know fully what that looks like, although I do think that Colorado will accept Oregon graduates, which is great to know for those who graduated in Oregon. And I know that probably you have a number of other pending questions about that. So please do pay attention to our email list, our newsletters, and we posted a link for you to sign up if you're interested in the psilocybin program specifically. We will send you news as soon as we have it. There's a lot that is just still kind of in the works and being sorted out. But if you're interested in our program, we'd be happy to get you more information about it as soon as we can. So lots of really exciting stuff on the horizon. Kayli, thank you so much for coming out and talking with everyone here today.
Yeah.
So much enthusiasm, and I know people are going to listen to this afterward and they're going to have questions, be writing in and asking, but we really look forward to working with you as a trainer in our upcoming program. And so congratulations on your baby so recently, and taking the time to do this with our audience.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks so much for having me. This was fun.
Yeah, thanks so much. All right, everybody, have a beautiful day. We'll see you soon. Bye.
Bye.